Man's equal affinity to do both the good and evil is an important part of the world that we live in. Characters that demonstrate both a good and evil nature often seem to be the most realistic or play important roles in the stories that we read. This is because of how they often appear to be more human realistic in their skewed ethical justification and that they give to their actions, and moral ambiguity allows for a writer to make a villain sympathetic or a hero hated. Hello, my name is Caeleb, and today I will be proving to you how Dr. Jekyll, in the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, attempts to deny this moral ambiguity within himself, and in doing so personifies the existence of moral ambiguity. Now, what is moral ambiguity? Moral ambiguity is a complexity of character that all living, thinking beings have. That is why people can do both good and evil. Now, what do I mean by moral ambiguity? Now, another way to put it, many of us have probably heard the phrase, the world is not always written in black and white or shades of gray. In this case, black being absolute evil, white being absolute good, and gray being every single possible mix in between. This is a good demonstration of how good and evil can be ambiguous. But where do the concepts of good and evil come from? In their article, The Meaning of Good and Evil, J.S. Mackenzie reasons that good at least seems to be something involved in our nature as thinking beings, and to have the kind of complexity that is implied by its definite opposite, evil. This way of defining good and evil allows for us to see the apparent existence of moral ambiguity that Dr. Jekyll will attempt to deny, as it demonstrates that while good and evil may be opposites, they can interact and mix with each other to certain degrees, while still maintaining their position as opposites. Because good and evil are primarily defined by each other being opposites, it brings questions to action that can be done with both good and or evil intent. A lie can be told to deceive someone, but it can also be used to protect a person at the same time. Attacking another person is a crime, but when done in self-defense, it is justified and therefore good. But this reasoning has its flaws, as it suggests that good is in the nature of thinking beings, and that is the flaw, because thinking beings have an equal chance to do evil as they do good. Now, there are two different aspects that I would like to focus on when trying to prove that Jekyll is morally ambiguous. And those aspects are based around the utilitarian ethics and Kantian ethics. Utilitarian ethics is essentially no matter what pathway you take to get there, as long as the result is good, then the actions you took there also would be defined as good. This is usually called ends justifies the means. And then there's Kantian ethics, which only judges the intention of the action, not the actual outcome. It is with this hypothetical weight of justification that we can balance the scale in which we will judge Jekyll and or Hyde. But who are Jekyll and Hyde? Well, Jekyll is a respectable doctor. He is calm and collected, thoughtful. He is well respected for his wisdom, and he is extremely patient. He says that his greatest fault is that he always has an impatient need to feel that he must be entertained. And to cover up these faults, he decides to put on a more great and respectable personality instead of creating a negative public opinion. Meanwhile, after drinking a potion that he created, he becomes Mr. Hyde. Hyde is the exact opposite of Jekyll. Hyde is violent, impulsive. He gives into his impatience, and he has killed 3 people, 2 of which we know of. 1, he trampled a young girl, and 2, he beat an old man to death with a cane. Now, Dr. Jekyll had noble intentions behind his experiment, even if he knew that his method would be viewed as unethical. Jekyll discussed his experiment with his good friend Dr. Lanyon, and this left him feeling condemned by Lanyon. But Jekyll put aside any qualms that he had with his experiment's ethics in order to prove that he could remove the ambiguity of emotions from himself. He believed that this could be done by separating the good in his soul from the evil in it. In concept, this does stand to reason, as if you were to separate the good and evil and leave yourself with only good and only evil, you would have only 2 choices, absolute good and absolute evil. This removes any sort of mix of the two, thus canceling out ambiguity. Now, while it may be true that he did succeed in separating the evil from his soul, separation is not removal. Separation implies splitting into sections, not getting rid of. This distinction is important to keep in mind if we are to judge Jekyll. Now, we can come to the conclusion that he is a villain, depending on which method of reasoning we use. His unorthodoxness he describes mystical experiment ended the lives of several people, and yet Jekyll, knowing this, still continued to use his potion to become Hyde. His meddling with the human soul was wrong, and the fact that even he himself, at the very least, felt uneasy about the ethics of his experiment proves this. Now, it is a different story for Hyde, who is pure evil and has no ambiguity, but there's evidence that proves that Hyde may have never existed, meaning that all the actions were done by a singular individual, and thus the judgment would rest solely upon Jekyll, proving his moral ambiguity. Now, the evidence that proves Hyde's non-existence comes from a letter that Jekyll wrote to his lawyer, Mr. Utterson, before he died. This letter gives no clarification on how or when Hyde came into existence, only that at some point he could take over Jekyll's shared body. Now, due to the vagueness of Jekyll's letter around the entity known as Edward Hyde, we can come up with two stories. The first being that Jekyll could turn into Hyde and was able to use Hyde as an alter ego to get away from the stress and rules of his elite social standing, and eventually Hyde would take over the body. Or the second being that Jekyll was in control the entire time and came up with the story of Hyde in order to save face when he saw his end in sight. Now, in their article, Was Jekyll Hyde?, Eric T. Olson brings up similar claims, and says that it depends upon which way of telling the story is entirely dependent upon whether Jekyll is Hyde and whether Jekyll and Hyde are two people or one person. Now, there are a few concepts that I would like to clarify before moving onward, and that is the concepts of personhood and cohabitation. Personhood essentially is a concept of whether a person is a thinking, rational being and thus would be considered as a person. Olson claims that personhood will not offer any help in determining whether or not Jekyll and Hyde truly exist, as while both of them do fit the parameters of being a person, they cannot both fit those parameters at the same time, as in order for Jekyll to fit the parameters, Hyde must not exist and vice versa, creating a paradox if both characters are to be considered people. The second topic is cohabitation, and this must be clarified because this is the basis of whether Hyde has existence or lack thereof. Cohabitation, simply stated, is saying that two thinking beings can inhabit one body at the same time. Now, when we look at cohabitation, Jekyll did succeed in his experiment, and this led to the creation of Hyde. But this again creates the problems, as both of them would share the same memories later, as we would see, when Jekyll writes memories of Hyde and actions that Hyde did in the first person, instead of talking about saying that Hyde did it. Now, this will end up turning the novel from one of cohabitation into one of Jekyll's duality. Instead of Jekyll versus Hyde, it will be Jekyll's inner good versus his inner evil. The book presents a case of Jekyll's hidden complexity of character through his duality, not his alleged cohabitation. Now, we can look at Jekyll's own words for more proof of this. Shortly after turning into Hyde, Jekyll specifically stated, "Let me but escape into my laboratory door, and give me but a second or two to mix and swallow the draught I had always standing ready." And whatever he had done, Edward Hyde would pass away like a stain upon the breath of a mirror, and there in his stead, quietly at home, trimming the midnight lamp in his study, a man who could afford to laugh at suspicion would be Dr. Henry Jekyll. Now, this added with the fact that Jekyll himself refers to Hyde as a cloak in which he could take on and take off as he pleased, ends up showing that Hyde was just a concept that he created. So he ended up creating a fake name and gives said name access to his money, so that later in the book he could end up getting off the hook when he was caught. And on top of that, he decides that the best way to use this new transformation of his is to commit his own crimes for his own pleasures, and then if caught, escape into the night and turn into Dr. Jekyll again. This selfish deceit on Jekyll's part demonstrates his moral ambiguity. Hyde was made up of all the things that Jekyll wanted to throw out of his soul, but those bad things ended up sticking around. And this is where the idea of duality becomes all the more important in proving Hyde's non-existence. Jekyll did not create a separate soul. He split his own. Picture the devil and angel on the shoulder of a cartoon character. This is quite literally what Jekyll has done. Jekyll split his soul in two. He decided to keep the black and keep the white, but he removed all of the moral gray area. And this meant that instead, he left himself with only two choices to either be fully good or fully evil. This novel is not one of cohabitation, but the realities of Jekyll's duality. The reality that man is morally ambiguous, and the inescapable complexity of character that allows for them to embody both good and evil is demonstrated through Jekyll's own corrupt actions. Hyde truly does not exist, and Jekyll made up the story in order so that he could shift the blame to a character that no one would ever expect him to play. One reason that Jekyll and Hyde is often looked at, though, under the reasoning of cohabitation, is that Jekyll himself states that he recognized the thorough and primitive duality of man. This is the concept that he initially struggled with. But this is Jekyll's skewed perception. He himself struggled with the idea that God put a balancing factor in man, one that Jekyll would later regret removing. He became too prideful to see that the representation of the balance that he had been struggling with all this time was there and that it was necessary. When Jekyll masqueraded as Hyde, he was so arrogant in what he perceived as a newfound freedom that it took him too long to see that he had taken his evils too far. Jekyll's consciousness would end up swinging back and forth like a pendulum from one extreme of his shattered soul to the other in an attempt to balance the scales that he had broken. Dr. Henry Jekyll was a disillusioned villain as well as an idealistic hero. He wanted to prove that he could live without the evil machinations of his soul, but in trying to ignore them, their power over him only managed to grow. He removed the moral complexity that all people have and left himself with two choices. Again, those would be that of absolute good and absolute evil. Jekyll in his wisdom could see the differences between the two, but without the moral complexity of character that all people are born with, he had no ability to pick between the two. Jekyll's strange and sad case highlights the importance of moral ambiguity and the complexity of characters that we as human beings possess. Jekyll may have attempted to remove his moral ambiguity, but his denial only led his moral ambiguity growing to a point where instead of him controlling it, it would control him. Thank you for listening. All right, now I will be taking questions. What questions do you have? Come on, I know that didn't explain it that well.
So, do you say that because we remove those grades of gray, those states between white and black, it becomes like it became for him hard to balance between white and black. So he needed to kind of oscillate between those.
Yes. Throughout the book, he goes between being Jekyll and what he calls Hyde. Hyde is the exact opposite personality and is usually either seen doing a crime or killing someone, while Jekyll himself is like a very calm, almost shy person. But when he removed the so-called gray area in his soul, he would either switch between being fully good or fully evil with absolutely no in between. He didn't realize this until it was too late, though. Is Ryan okay?
I was really admiring the topic and how you presented it, and wow, that's a very interesting topic. I would even be envious of something like that. I would like to present one day something like that. So first of all, great job. Secondly, I have one question. What lessons can we take out of this story? So can this story be applied to real life? Can we take something for us personally out of it? What do you personally feel and what do you think about it?
I personally feel that it's kind of like a warning to kind of be careful when messing around. Specifically with Jekyll, he needs to be careful when messing around with the good and evil within his soul, but also with us with the importance of making sure that the decisions we make are the right ones. Because Jekyll made one wrong decision and it led to the deaths of 3 people and himself. Thanos.
Yeah, Caleb. So, do you think for the students, do you have any other examples of morally ambiguous characters in fiction or movies or things that maybe some of the students would be familiar with?
I have a couple. In the Harry Potter book series, you have Snape, who appears antagonistic for a while, but he's actually doing it to try and protect Harry.
Oh,
You have, who was it? You have Thanos in the Avengers movies, whose entire ethical justification was that he wanted to save the universe, but he has to kill half of it to get there.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Evan. If you need the
Do
mic.
you think it will be evil if a person wants an evil consequence or if he's doing evil things? Like, if he wants to have a good consequence by doing evil things, will it be evil or what?
So if you could have, I think what you're saying is like if it had evil intentions, but it had a good outcome.
Not really outcomes that you are doing it evil, but your goal is good.
Well, I would say it depends to a varying degree, because like with the example of Thanos, killing half the universe, I think all of us would agree is a bad idea. But also, it would have a better outcome for those that remain. That would be an example of that. I don't think that it's correct, but you could have something like if you have it on accident happen, then it wouldn't be seen as a good outcome. But if you have it if you're purposely trying with an evil intention to achieve a good goal, it's still an evil action due to the intention being evil behind it. Like the way that you get there being evil is what would make it evil. Jared?
So here you propose the idea of cohabitation where they live in each other and where there are two souls in the same body. So you're proposing that because the stronger one would be in control, that there would only be that it wouldn't work as well.
Well, no, I'm not proposing that. I'm proposing that Jekyll himself doesn't have cohabitation that he claims to.
That's what I got that.
Yeah, he created the idea of cohabitation is something that can exist. It's often viewed as more split personalities. I didn't look as much into that, but essentially with, in the case of Jekyll and Hyde can't possibly exist given the fact that at the beginning, Jekyll himself was in his right mind when he started doing all of this. But then as soon as he he came up with the name of Hyde. But then as soon as he starts getting caught, he starts blaming everything on Hyde and kind of distancing himself from that and tries to not turn into Hyde. The book itself actually has a really funny line within the first chapter, which is said from the lawyer who hears of Mr. Hyde and says, "If he be Mr. Hyde, then I shall be Mr. Seek." This was probably done to draw the similarities between the name Hyde and the word Hyde, as Jekyll would have been using Hyde himself to hide who he was while he did these things that he knew would cause his face, I guess, not social standing, to kind of get lowered.
One more from Leo and then we'll back, okay?
If it's impossible to be absolutely good, should we still try?
Yes.
Then why?
It is the principle of it. If you're not trying to be good and you are good, then there is we still have the choice to do good. If we choose not to do good, then are we choosing to do evil or choosing to do nothing? Because both could be seen as wrong from a moral standpoint, because choosing to do nothing can lead to bad outcomes, but choosing to do good will often lead to better ones.
All right, thank you, Caleb. A nice piece of original literary analysis. Very nicely done. Let's clap our hands.